So what I'm going to try to do here is attempt a brief philosophical analysis of the film Nosferatu. One of the things that came to mind is Freud's infamous question, Was will das Weib? What does a woman want? To which Lacan, in his characteristically somewhat sardonic sense, answered that what woman wants is a master who she can nevertheless dominate. And this is a reworking of the Kantian theory of the master. Kant argues that what man wants is a master, and yet what man wants is a master whom he can dominate. In fact, in Kant's essay or treatise on the Enlightenment, he writes that man can essentially sever his ties from his immaturity when he learns to become his own master, which is to say Kant basically makes the argument that to be an enlightened subject is to release oneself from the need for a master. Against this, the Freudian Lacanian theory is that an enlightened subject is the one who realizes that it is only through the master that they can properly access enjoyment. This is the Kantian subject, the subject of maturity, if you will, versus the Sadian subject, the subject of immaturity, of enjoyment in and through his own obscenity. In fact, there's an obscene figure in Nosferatu that illustrates this quite perfectly, and it is the figure of Herr Nock, the real estate bourgeois character who serves his evil master. And what's important to note is that he remains an obscene subject to the extent that he really is only evil to the extent that he does it to shock other people with his perversity and obscenity, which is to say he stages it for the gaze of the other. There's a wonderful scene in the movie where he's in a prison cell and he waits until the warden comes to dramatically bite the head off a pigeon, and the camera really dwells on it, and for a moment it becomes sort of comic and gruesome at the same time. And I think the reason that this is actually consistently shot in this way in the movie is that he can never truly become evil in a Kantian sense, which is to say, from a Kantian perspective, true evil is like nature. It's totally indifferent to life. It is death personified, as the film says of Count Orlok over and over again. It's not that he is evil because he enjoys being evil. He is evil simply because he has universalized negation of life, namely death. Against this, the figure of Herr Nock enjoys being perverse. He enjoys being obscene. In this sense, he remains locked within the Christian dynamic. In fact, towards the end of the film, spoilers, when Herr Nock is killed, he says himself, "I am a blasphemy, and I could not become the prince of the rats." And from a Kantian perspective, this is again the difference between Kant and Sade. He can't be truly evil because he enjoys his perversion. He has to stage it for the gaze of the good in order to convince himself that he is a subject of evil. This means that he cannot become truly the embodiment of evil. He remains a blasphemy. He remains someone who nevertheless is stuck within the logic, the moral, normative logic of good versus evil. Whereas true evil doesn't even recognize good as such. It is an absolutizing force of negation of life. But to briefly go back to the original question about the master and the slave, as it were, which of course has Hegelian overtones, the central insight of the Freudian theory of the hysteric is that man, and indeed woman, requires a master in order to access their own enjoyment. They are barred from their enjoyment if they cannot have it, either in defiance of the master or with and through the master's authority. And if you look at the central character of this movie, played by Depp, it's quite interesting that it essentially begins with the problem of her enjoyment. That she doesn't know how to want, how to live. And so she hysterically performs her inability to desire for her father, who at first hand embraces her, who accepts her eccentricities. But then when she strips naked and goes out into the woods, as she tells us, she loses the support of her father, who now sees her as an abomination. And it is at this exact point that she makes the properly traumatic switch towards becoming a subject of Satan, which is to say she invokes the master as animal, the master as beast, Count Orlok, so that she can continue to access her now forbidden enjoyment. And here I think it's actually important to note, once again, that the Kantian theory of the master works like this. He says, man is an animal in search of a master, and yet he secretly wants to dominate this master. However, perhaps from the perspective of German Romanticism, to which this film is of course indebted, not only through its visuals, the references to Caspar David Friedrich, etc., but in light of German Romanticism, perhaps it is not that man is an animal in search of a master, it is that man wants a master who is an animal, and that is of course Count Orlok, the master as animal. The one who comes to dominate the subject through life-negating force. And in this complete subjective destitution, there is indeed a kind of pleasure. And it is in this sense that I would disagree with many of the contemporary criticisms of this film that have said that it lacks the erotic character that you might find, for example, in Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Yes, there is no overt sexuality on screen, in the sense of any kind of erotic dimension, but instead the central dynamic, the logic, if you will, of Depp's submission to the master so that she might access her own enjoyment is thereby deeply erotic. In fact, spoilers for the film ends in what you might call a kind of Liebestod, in which she becomes the master of the master. To go back again to Lacan's quip, in response to the Freudian question, was will das Weib? What does woman want? Lacan answers by saying, woman wants a master whom she can dominate. And the film essentially seems to posit that woman wants an animal who is her master, whom she can nevertheless dominate. And therein lies the true enjoyment of the hysteric subject. Now, one of the things that Slavoj Žižek has argued is that this makes woman a true subject and the man a fake subject, and I'm going to try to explain that here briefly. In fact, if we look at it through the lens of the film, the love interest, the husband of Depp, is a kind of pathetic figure. Even his courage is because he's lacking imagination, and I think that this is quite intentional in the film. When he goes into the village with the gypsies, there's this stunning sequence where they all begin laughing at him when one of the main gypsies laughs in his face. They're laughing at his bravery because his bravery reveals a lack of imagination, indeed an ignorance as to the danger that he is facing. And in this sense, he's a kind of ignorant subject, a subject who altogether too easily enjoys things in life. Whereas Depp says that she married him because he was the one who allowed her to overcome the short circuit of her enjoyment, which is to say it was through his banal enjoyment, his integration into life, his seamless existence, that she was able to convince herself for a moment that maybe this is how life could be for her as well. And yet this is precisely why he has to be sent off on an errant mission that doesn't accomplish anything, that in fact only accomplishes, spoilers, the death of Herr Nock, who was, of course, the master of the husband, who was the bourgeois master who said that he had to go to the count in the first place in order to become a stably hired person in the firm. In fact, there's a subtext to the story, I think, a joke almost, that real estate is actually one of the places where people truly go to die, and that Orlok is the one who's leaving the mansion, as it were. In fact, there's an opening shot where the husband goes into the real estate office, and it's filmed in such a way as if he is walking right into the belly of the beast, a foreshadowing, of course, of sorts. There's so much more to unpack here. Like, I took some more notes, like Lacan's famous answer to the student protesters of 1968, that they were simply hysterics looking for a new master and that they would get one. And that, in a sense, this is what this film is about. It is about the finding of a new master. But to return briefly to the Kantian theory of enlightenment, the shortcoming of the Kantian theory of enlightenment is that man doesn't really release himself when he becomes mature, as Kant puts it, when he is able to release himself from the master. It is precisely at this point, as Freud observes, that the subject becomes properly hysterical. And so man becomes trapped in his own supposed freedom. And here emerges the Kantian paradox, which is that man can act freely only when it presents itself to him as a compulsion. Du kannst, denn du sollst. You must because you can because you must. And hysteria is therefore precisely the way in which the subject becomes truly free. Namely, not simply by submitting oneself to domination and a master, but by choosing the master to whom one wishes to subject oneself. Hence, Lily Rose Depp's subject here, feminine subject, isn't simply the woman who has to be rescued by the man, but in characteristically Dave Eggers' style, she is actually the true autonomous subject, the true subject of the Enlightenment, as it were. The woman who embraces her role, who goes all the way, who dominates the animal whom she has chosen to be dominated by. And in this dialectical embrace, in this Liebestod, if you will, we have the triumph of Enlightenment reason. That is Dave Eggers' Nosferatu. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.